Howdy and buenos dias. I was getting my background a little bit and talk about a couple of ideas that we've been kicking around, and then talk specifically about one thing that the last bill we're gonna drop before the summer recess. But before I get to that, I want to know a little bit more about who's in the room. So if you're in government, raise your hand. Okay, put it down. Industry, academia. Okay, a few of y'all. Press. Got my eye on y'all. Well, first off, to Palo Alto Networks, thank you for letting me be here today, and thanks for being flexible. We have a hearing this morning that started with talking about ISIS, and something I don't want to miss, so we're going to be getting to that quickly. My background. I'm one of 4 members of Congress with a degree in computer science. One more group before we get into that. How many of y'all, anybody here testified before OGR? Sorry. No, and we'll get into that in a second. But I'm one of 4 members of Congress allegedly that have a degree in computer science. My degree, I got it at Texas A&M University. And Giga Maggies, right back at you. This is our year, you know. Anybody else in the SEC school, graduated from SEC school? You're welcome. When we came to the SEC, Texas A&M increased the average GPA of the SEC. But when I graduated at 22, I went straight in the CIA. I was a clandestine. I was a member of the National Clandestine Service. I was the dude in the back alleys at 4 o'clock in the morning. It was a great experience. Counterterrorism was a majority of my career, but I did do some offensive cyber operations as well. And I had in addition to collecting intelligence on threats to the homeland, I had to brief members of Congress, and I was shocked by the caliber of some of our elected officials. And so my mama said, you're either part of the problem, part of the solution. So I decided to run for Congress, and I lost by 700 votes, which is not a lot of votes. I've literally run into 750 people in the grocery store. They're like, hey, Hurd, how's the campaign going? It's like, I lost. They're like, oh, shucks, we forgot to go vote, you know? So I made sure the second time those people did not forget. But I'm actually, it's easy to say now I'm glad for the loss. Back then, I wasn't, because I had the opportunity to join a boutique consulting firm called Crumpton Group, where I became a partner, and then helped, you know, we would answer strategic questions. A U.S. company would come to us and say, the Shanghai Stock Exchange just opened to 39 Chinese companies. How do we get in? Or a Mexican company would come to us and say, we've operated in Latin America for 72 years. We're getting ready to buy a plant in the Philippines. What are those external factors that are going to impact our ability to make business decisions? And we were a bunch of former CIA guys, and our clients came to us and said, hey, we have some cybersecurity issues. And being good CIA guys, we said, we know a guy. I helped Matt DeVoe start Fusion X. And, you know, we did technical vulnerability assessment, penetration testing. It was a great experience to not only understand the impact and the threat to the private sector, but to also understand the resources that we have in the private sector. And so having that experience and bringing it into Congress has been good. I've been in Congress for 18 months. Is that right, Stoney? About 18 months. We'll call it 18 months. Feels like I've been here for like 5 terms. I have some of the wounds to prove it. And I'm on Homeland Security. My district goes from San Antonio to El Paso. 2 time zones, 820 miles of the border. It takes 10.5 hours to drive from one corner to the other at 80 miles an hour, which is the speed limit like 75% of the district. I realized recently that it's not the speed limit in all of Texas, unfortunately. Even though my intent was not to speed, I still got a speeding ticket. So sorry, I couldn't pass that up, Stoney. My chief of staff's getting nervous when I go off script. I also serve as the chairman of the IT subcommittee within Oversight and Government Reform. One of the problems I've seen in government is that a lot of times we pass these very broad pieces of legislation that is so broad it requires a rulemaking process, which then is where unelected folks are making legislation. And Congress, we're talking about asserting our Article 1 authorities. Well, part of the problem is we've created ourselves, right? And I think the other issue with oversight is sometimes we don't get into the weeds enough when it comes to our oversight role. And traditionally, oversight, if you've come from before the committee, it was kind of known for big headlines, things like that. But I've tried to use the committee to drill down. And one of the issues we talk a lot about is FTARA. Most of y'all know what that is. It's actually a good piece of legislation that strengthened the role of the CIO within the federal agency. It's crazy. Like, I use the Department of Interior as an example. A $1 billion IT budget. But the CIO of Interior only had like 24% control over that budget. In what world would having a subordinate have more budgetary authority than you make sense? And so one of the things that I think is incumbent upon Congress is to make sure the right people have the right authorities, right? And then we're going to hold the people with those authorities accountable for executing those authorities. And that's what we've tried to do with our FTARA scorecard. This is also not to be used as an I gotcha moment, right? Because in reality, one of the ways that we score on this is on the risk management piece. Are you hitting your goals? And honestly, if you're not, you get a higher score by being honest than by saying everything's hunky-dory. Because we want to make sure that we create a level of transparency to what's happening. Now, look, I recognize, when I was in the cybersecurity business, not once did we ever not get in. Everybody in this room knows you got to begin with the presumption of breach, right? You give an adversary enough time, they're going to get in. How quickly can you detect them? Can you quarantine them? And can you kick them out? So I know that principle. And so, but if you have done a technical vulnerability assessment, you should know how many critical vulnerabilities you have. You should know how many of those critical vulnerabilities have already been sorted out and fixed, and how many more you have to go and fix in the future. Right, these are some of the very basic questions. If you don't know those things, then yeah, you're going to have a difficult time in front of oversight and government reform. But these are some of the questions that you should be asking yourselves and making sure that information is back into Congress. One of the areas, we've looked at 4 areas on the subcommittee. Cybersecurity is one. And really up here, that means information sharing. The Cybersecurity Act of 2015, big piece of legislation. To be honest, it should have been passed 6 years ago. Right? Now we have a framework in which you share information. Right? But is there going to be two-way conversation? I say that we have a year and a half to prove this bill's worth. To make sure, I think private sector will be providing information voluntarily. If the federal government is not giving information back, people are going to ask, why are we doing this? Right? And we got to make sure we have a framework in which we share that information. What should we be sharing? It has to be timely. Right? It has to be actionable. And DHS is making some great strides in doing that. But I think there's a way we can go even a little bit further. I look at the financial services industry. They know the next level of malware that is probably going to be developed to attack their system. And I want to hear from them what those requirements are. Right? And if we turn those questions into requirements and get that back into the national security infrastructure, and have the national security infrastructure use its resources to answer some of those questions, and then get that information back to everyone, that's how we make sure that our companies, our businesses, our critical infrastructure providers are able to be one step ahead. Now, it sounds pretty simple, and honestly, turning requirements or having questions from whether it's the ISACs or individual companies, turning that into requirements, that's the easy part. We actually already kind of have a framework to do that. Getting that to the collectors, like what I used to do, is a achievable goal. But being able to, once we get collection and an answer, to get that back into the hands of the people that need it, that's the really hard part. And I hear this over and over from partners in industry and saying, we got a piece of information 4 weeks later. That does no one any good. And so we have to figure out a ways that we can work together. And the reality is if we think we're going to be able to defend ourselves, that the private sector can defend itself by itself, and the government can defend itself by itself, and be okay, we're going to be wrong, right? That's kind of like thinking the Maginot Line is going to protect us protect the French from the Germans when you can just go around it, right? So this is where, the next step is, what information are we sharing? Are we sharing it quickly? The idea of, do you have the right people in industry, have the classifications in order to get the information they need? The answer is no, right? And when you have folks in private sector that are willing to pay for the background assessments and things like that, we should be able to figure out ways to have more people with the right classifications so that we can increase that level of partnership. So that's one of the areas that we're looking at and trying to refine this idea of how we have the federal government do what the federal government does best and can only do, and that's collection against adversaries, nation states, and folks like Russian organized crime. And the other area we've been looking at is privacy. To me, this is actually very simple. When I ran for Congress, I didn't think I was going to be, one of the privacy guys. But the reality is this: encryption is important. We should be strengthening encryption, not weakening it. Encryption is good for our national security. Encryption is good for our economy, and we should be doing everything we can to protect it. Right? Oh, and by the way, our civil liberties are not burdens. They're the things that make our country great. We can chase bad guys. We can protect our civil liberties, and we can defend our digital infrastructure all at the same time. It's hard, and we need to stop having law enforcement in the private sector talk past one another, right? But we can do this. We must do this. The future of our nation depends on it. Third area we've been talking about is emerging technology. And for me, this really is, how do we prevent the federal government from getting in the way of entrepreneurship? Right? I use the example, most people have a technical background here. The Internet of Things and the questions surrounding that is going to make the conversation on Ethernet and token ring look like a pillow fight, right? And guess what? It wasn't the government that made the decision that Ethernet won, right? It was the markets. It was the private sector that did that. And so there is a natural inclination for government to react when something bad happens, right? And sometimes that stifles growth, sometimes that stifles innovation. So this is an area we'll continue to look at. The fourth area that we probably spend most of our time on, which is something I not once said on the campaign trail, is IT procurement. Nobody's going to hold a rally for IT procurement, right? But this is an important topic. And again, I represent a very rural part of Texas. And when my chief of staff was with me when he first became chief of staff, he goes, "Hey, boss, what are you going to talk about?" And I said, IT procurement. And his face goes even paler than it is now. But when you tell people that the federal government spends $80 billion a year on IT procurement and 80% of that is on old and outdated stuff, people are immediately outraged, right? And one of the ways that you can reduce the size and scope of the federal government is you improve the way we purchase IT goods and services. And also, not only is it about saving money, it's about increasing the computer-human interaction and the customer service we have with our customers, right? And creating more efficiencies. It shouldn't take you 6 clicks to get to the information that you need. And this is something that we're responsible to the people that are paying our salaries, right? Now, how can we do that? One of the things I thought that when I first got in, I was like, and I'm hearing all these problems, the problems with the FAR. The fact that I even know what the FAR is crazy, all right? The problem is not the FAR, the Federal Acquisition, what is the R? Regulations. The problem is not with the FAR. The problem is with the implementation of the FAR. Why do we stop having conversation with vendors when there's a proposal response to an RFP? That's actually the time you should be engaging to ensure you answering the question. The problem is that we don't have line people that are using the IT goods and services involved in the purchasing of the IT goods and services. That's why we're trying to make sure that CIOs in various agencies have the authority to do that, to get involved, to make some of these decisions. Now we're getting pushbacks from CFOs across the agency. That's okay, because that's why when we do hearings, we're going to be bringing the CIO and the CFO together to be like, what's going on? How can we get this done? because I want to make sure that we have our IT professionals have the tools they need. And there's debate going on about this idea of a modernization fund. Right? The concept makes sense, right? How do we make sure that we take the government and constantly evolving? But guess what? We don't just have to modernize in 2016. We got to constantly stay on the edge. We got to constantly be evolving, right? And I think the way we can do that is by making sure that our professionals within the agencies are able to realize the savings they get. You know, perfect example. We had a hearing recently that we learned that just 2 agencies, right, Julie? It was 2 agencies that realized $2 billion in savings by their transitioning into the cloud. That's real money. And that's only 2 out of 24 CFO agencies. Now, the problem is because of the size and scope of many of these projects, the agencies aren't able to realize that savings within that calendar year, right? So let's take that savings that's realized, put it into a working capital fund, and give you the ability to use that money over 3 years in order to modernize your IT systems. And every agency gets to do it. It's not one central fund, right? And so that's basically what we're going to be dropping today. We're calling it the Move IT Act of 2016. That empowers people and empowers the agencies to do that. Now, there's going to be a debate, which is good. And I think, you know, between that and the modernization fund, there's some place that we can all get to a point and see something done in this current year. Because we got to make sure that we have the tools and the ability for our agencies to adapt and change and purchase the latest technology in order to keep our digital infrastructure safe. So that's the Move IT Act. Y'all heard it here first. And I'm sure there will be more conversations. And honestly, we need the input of folks that are doing this, that are in the trenches. And we welcome the feedback that y'all have on this proposal. It should be out this morning. So I have 1 minute and 48 seconds left. That's probably enough time for 2 quick questions and quick answers. Who's first? Yes, ma'am, in the back. Green shirt.
How confident are you that the State Department's cybersecurity is adequate?
I'm not confident. I'm not confident about our cybersecurity posture across the entire federal government, right? And you know, this is one of those areas that, you know, if you think you have everything on lockdown, then guess what? Somebody's in your system, right? But I do realize a lot of times the problem is not with the implementation of technologies that lead to good digital system hygiene. It's having the right leadership in the right places. And that's, I think, something you have some good examples across the government, but not enough. But this is one area when we look, and I can't recall what State Department's grade is on FITARA. It's probably a C or a D, because that's where most of the government is, right? You had 1B, 1F, you know, and everybody else was somewhere in the middle. But this is always an area that we're looking at. One more question. We'll go to this side of the room. Gentleman that already has the mic.
That would be me, thanks. So I've met with several federal CIOs, and most of them tell me that security for mobile devices, IoT, is not one of their top 25 concerns. How do we boost that up to get it up into a higher priority?
Listen, I think part of it is making sure they're aware of the problem, right? And, you know, this notion of, you know, BYOD, and, you know, in the private sector, it's pretty prevalent. The fact that people are using their devices at work, you know, on their public Wi-Fi. We have to make sure our agencies, this is maybe something that we look at when we do our FITARA scores, or how they look at, you know, at this, their strategy on dealing with mobile devices. But that's an interesting point, because again, I saw something in 2020, 83% of the information that crisscrosses the internet is going to be from mobile devices. It's crazy. That's a huge number, and we have to be prepared for it. And we're probably not, but it starts with having the conversation. So thank you. That is my time. Look, I appreciate y'all, the Palo Alto networks for letting me be here, for bringing these folks together to have these conversations, because the only way that we're going to make sure that we have a digital infrastructure that's resilient and is able to allow the federal government to do its job is if we're working together, and these kind of forums are important for that. So thank you, and God bless y'all.